Hey everyone, welcome back to Krat's Couch, and this is my guide for Arcane Mage and Wrath of the Lich King, with the goal being to give you everything you need from just starting out playing as a mage, all the way to full optimization and min-max. As always, the sections are time-stamped in the description for your convenience, so you can hop around the video as needed. And with that, let's get started. So first I want to cover some of the changes to mage abilities that affect every spec, from going from TBC to Wrath of the Lich King. The first of which is Evocation. Now it's going from a 8-minute base cooldown to a 4-minute base cooldown. And also Invisibility now goes off after 3 seconds, and damage doesn't interrupt it, so it's a lot easier to, when you're wiping, to get out of combat, save yourself some consumes and not die. Another change is to Molten Armor. So Molten Armor now, instead of just giving a flat crit rate, now gives a percentage of your spirit converted to critical strike rating. I have it as 55% here, that's because I have the Glyph. The base amount is 35%, and then the Glyph gives an extra 20%, and it's our third best Glyph. Another change is that Blizzard ticks can now crit. So as you'll see here, some of these ticks are going to crit, so it's just important to know when you're evaluating crit strike rating, because Blizzard is what we primarily use for our AoE. And lastly, I want to talk about our new mage ability, Mirror Image. So with Mirror Image, it's a 3-minute cooldown, and you pop this, and it'll attack the enemy. Now, right now, the AIs can be a little buggy, so they're not attacking right now. But if they do attack, and they last their 30 seconds doing attacks, over that course of that time, they can do up to like 13k damage. So it's a pretty good GCD. But you can also just pre-pop it before a pull. So I'll go into more detail of how to optimally use this in the opener and the AoE section. But basically, they also take you off of the threat table. So you'll still be generating threat, but you can't get aggro. So if you're this only person, you're just attacking a mob, it's great for soloing, because then the mob will have to attack the mirror images before it gets to you. Attack and kill them. And then in a raid situation, it'll basically take you off the threat table because everyone else will be above you. You'll still be generating threats, so when they go away, you'll be back to where you were, but it's like Blessing of Protection. You won't be able to, the boss won't be attacking you. So it's a great time to use it at the beginning of a boss, right before the pull, or also an AoE when you know that your tanks aren't going to be able to hold aggro on a bunch of the mobs. They just did a big giga pull. You can pop the mirror images, go ham on AoE, and know that you're not going to pull aggro. Now I'm going to walk through the talent tree and some of the changes going from TBC to Wrath of the Lich King for each of the different arcane talents, as well as some of the different arcane specs that you can go. But first, I need to cover the biggest change for arcane is that there's been a change to Arcane Blast itself and the debuff that it gives. So before in TBC, it would increase the mana cost of your Arcane Blast and reduce the cast time of your Arcane Blast. Now what it does is it increases the damage of all arcane spells, as well as the mana cost of Arcane Blast, and this effect will stack up to 4 times. And lasts for 6 seconds or until an arcane spell is used. And basically what this means is you're going to stack it up to 4 at a very general level. This means you're going to stack it up to 4 using Arcane Blast, and you're going to use Arcane Missiles to drop that debuff, and then you're going to continue to restack it. And I'll obviously cover the nuances here more in the rotation section, but that's just a general arcane change that is pivotal to how the spec works. Alright, so now some of the changes to the talent tree. I'm not going to go through every single talent, but I'm going to try and cover the important ones, the ones that you should actually just know about. It's good, smart to know. So Arcane Stability now reduces the pushback for both Arcane Missiles and Arcane Blast. Arcane Focus now only increases the hit of your arcane spells by 3%, so now we need 8% hit, 7% if you have a Draenei in your party. Magic Attunement now also increases the range of your arcane spells, so this isn't simply for Amp Magic and Dampen Magic now. It actually has some pretty good utility. Spell Impact now increases the damage of a number of different spells instead of just the crit chance. Student in Mind, new talent that increases your total spirit, which, as I covered with the Molten Armor change, is actually important because getting this gets you more spirit, which will get you more crit rating when you use Molten Armor, because you're always going to be using Molten Armor essentially with the Mage spec. Or rather, you're going to be using Molten Armor with all specs, I should just say that. Another new talent is Focus Magic, so it increases the target's chance to critically hit with spells by 3%. You can't cast this on yourself, so you have to give someone else 3% crit chance, but then when they crit, it'll give you a buff for 3% crit for 10 seconds, and most classes have good uptime with this. I have a Focus Magic section you can skip to that will dive into more of the details as far as what we think right now the best way to use Focus Magic is. Next, Torment the Weak's new ability. It increases the damage of all these different spells by 12% to snared or slowed targets. You might be saying the boss can't be slowed, but it applies to attack speed slows as well. So typically your DKs will always be applying Frost Fever, which will activate this, and if not them, then a Warriors for Thunderclap, and Feral Druids and Prot Pallies can also apply it. But typically you don't have to worry about this, your DK will apply it, and so it's 12% more damage. Huge talent. PoM is now a 2-minute cooldown, and you also cannot activate PoM and Arcane Power at the same time, so that will affect how Opener and some other things work, but I'll get into that later. And then additionally, Arcane Potency now increases the critical strike chance of your next damaging spell after gaining clear casting and PoM, so PoM now activates Arcane Potency. Similarly, Arcane Power has been reduced from a 3-minute cooldown to a 2-minute cooldown, and it now deals 20% more damage while costing 20% more mana, as opposed to 30% more damage for 30% more mana back in TBC. And then Arcane Empowerment has also been changed to increase the damage of Arcane Blast as well as Arcane Missiles, and it also gives the raid buff, the 3% damage to all party and raid members. So there's 3 different classes that can provide this. It's your Rep Pallies, your BM Hunters, and Arcane Mages, so you want to make sure to have one of those, and we are one of those specs, those classes that can provide that buff. Arcane Flows, new talent, reduces the cooldown of PoM, Arcane Power, Invisibility by all those by 30%, and reduces the cooldown of Evocation by 2 minutes, so then your Evocation is 2 minutes, and if you use Tier 3 2-piece, then it can go down to 1 minute. Mind Mastery was nerfed from 25% to 15% for increasing the spell power by total int. Just a little aside. Missile Barrage, this is a linchpin of the Arcane spec, so what this basically does is gives your Arcane Blast 40% chance, and Arcane Barrage, Fireball, Frostbolt, and Frost Firebolt a 20% chance to give you a buff. It's called, we refer to it as Mbarr. It will reduce the duration of your next Arcane Missile that is cast by 2.5 seconds, as well as making it cost no mana. So this is huge. This is basically, you cast Arcane Blast. Ideally, you get this before you hit 4 stacks of the debuff, and then you use Arcane Missiles, consuming this Mbarr proc, and it's essentially what makes the Arcane spec the spec that it is. And lastly, we just have a couple new talents that increase our spell haste as well as the critical strike damage bonus of all of our spells. And then Arcane Barrage. So you could think of Arcane Barrage as a Fire Blast, but in the Arcane tree. It's an instant cast. It has travel time, though, as opposed to Fire Blast, which has no travel time. Launches a few missiles at the target, 3-second cooldown. So it's a great spell for movement, but that's pretty much all you use it for. You don't want to use this to dump your stacks. That's old way of thinking, and I'll get into that in the rotation section. And some talents that we pick up from the other trees is Incineration, just increases the critical strike chance of our Arcane Blast ability. And then we also go down to the tree to pick up Icy Veins from the Frost tree, as well as you get Precision then, which is going to give you some hit, so 3% hit from there. And also you pick up Ice Shards to increase the critical strike damage bonus of your Frost spells. And again, this is important because now that our Blizzard can, the ticks can crit, this will apply to that, and that increases our AoE damage significantly. Now, the spec that I'm showing here is kind of just the bare bones recommendation from me. As you can see, there's still 2 points left, and there's a number of different ways you can go about this. So some people are saying that you don't need Arcane Barrage at all. You could drop that, and you could pick up 3 points in Suited in the Mind. That's going to give you some more crit chance with 1 in range. Or some people are also thinking Arcane Stability to reduce pushback. Again, it's going to depend on the encounters, your raid environment. You should always have a pally for Conqueror. So each point of this, anytime you get pushback, is going to increase your damage some, but that's only on certain fights. And Nax, there's a few different times. There's some trash that can do cause you pushback, as well as some of the bosses, but only a few of them. You know, Thaddeus is pretty significant. Faralina, you can get hit with the Poison Bolt Volley. KTZ, there's the Frostbolt Volley, etc. So there's you could put 3 points in that if you want to make sure that you're capped on pushback. The first point in Suited in the Mind, something to note, is that it gives 4% as opposed to the subsequent ones, which are 3%. And again, this is going to give you a little bit of regen and that crit chance, so that's good. Range is always nice. Range can definitely be the difference between getting a few more casts off when a mob is being dragged during a speedrun or something like that, so it can definitely be pretty big for your damage. Keep in mind that something like this at the beginning of Wrath of the Lich King is like 0.2 to 0.3% crit chance per talent point. So, you know, it's definitely something, but it's also not gigantic, right? And then Arcane Barrage, some people are saying not to take it. I highly recommend at least getting Arcane Barrage, because when you're having to do damage on the move, Fire Blast isn't enough to like kind of fill in the damage on the move. If you're at all far away from the target, Fire Blast is just a single GCD and that's it. So, you know, when you have Arcane Barrage, you can do Arcane Barrage, Fire Blast, Arcane Barrage. You know, Arcane Barrage alone on Hygen is going to be a lot of damage, because when you're doing the dance, you're going to be able to use Arcane Barrage, which could also proc an Arcane Missiles to get a quick Arcane Missiles off in between the lava waves. So Arcane Barrage, I highly recommend at least picking up that. From there, you could go either way. You could pick up 3 points in Suited in the Mind if you really wanted to. I think this is the spec a lot of people like. I think having 1 point in this so that you can just do any mechanics that are 30 yards, you can range them. I personally am kind of leaning towards something like this, but that could also change. So, you know, stay tuned, you know, hit the follow, hit the like, and subscribe. I'll update this if I've changed my mind after thinking about it some more or putting some things into practice. You know, follow me at twitch.tv/Kateria, as well as join the Discord, where there's continued debate on this, but I think Arcane Barrage is definitely worth the 1 point to pick up. Other people like Philippe at Wowhead, disagree with that because you only use this for movement, but there's a lot of times you can get the use out of it, and I think that's going to give you more damage than 1 point in Student of the Mind. However, some people disagree, so it's you could go a number of these different ways. And lastly, you notice I didn't mention Incanter's Absorption as a spec. That's because you wouldn't want to go this as your main spec. If anything, this would be an off spec. So with Incanter's Absorption, you can pick this up and you can Fire Ward and Sapper before a pull and get the buff. But it doesn't sim better for 60-second or longer fights, just for the short fights. So this is just something, if anything, you'd have as an off spec for fights with a lot of AoE damage, where you could Frost Ward or Fire Ward during downtime and then get the proc. But outside of that, it's just going to have that use. So don't include this in your main spec. If anything, just an off spec. And I know that on private servers, this got a lot of use, but that was because they could keep the buff rolling with Sulfuron Slammers. That has already been tried and tested, and you can't do that on live. So just know that the private server meta doesn't apply to this because of that changes. That was just a private server only kind of thing. And then for Glyphs, you just go Arcane Blast, Arcane Missiles, and Molten Armor. Those are the best three. There's nothing else that you're going to go that's better. And minor Glyphs, kind of just go whatever you want, but these are the three that I recommend. Now, I touched on it going over the Arcane spec and with PoM, but I want to have it as a separate section for people on the optimal uses of how to use Presence of Mind. So now that Presence of Mind also procs Arcane Potency, giving a 3% extra chance or extra critical strike chance, you want to use it in certain manners. So basically the bottom line is PoM is best used if you have movement. If you have movement in an encounter, then don't use it on the opener. Definitely use it on the move, okay? If this is just going to be a tank and spank like Patchwork, then you're going to want to use it for the opener, which you'll see in the opener section. But basically, because of that extra 30% crit chance, you don't want to use it on like your very first AB or something like that. You want to wait until you get up to your third stack of AB when you've got a fair amount of extra damage. You use PoM to get to that fourth one, and then you can use Arcane Missiles. Now, if I got a clear casting proc there, you would actually, because there's a little bit of delay with using that PoM, you would have the time to think, oh, I could actually do a clear casting proc on another AB while at 4 stacks. So that's just another little min-max trick to keep in mind, that because you'll be on GCD and you won't be having to mash up a next spell, you could do that as well. And then the last use of Presence of Mind is for AoE. This is actually pretty significant. So what you can do is wait for it to come off cooldown. All right, so now that it's off cooldown, have a macro that uses Presence of Mind as well as cast Blizzard. So you do that, and what happens is the Arcane Potency lasts for the entire Blizzard. So that means you're getting that extra 30% crit chance on all those Blizzard ticks, and then you still have the Presence of Mind buff to do a Flame Strike, an instant Flame Strike after that. So that's your best use of PoM for AoE, and actually just one of your best uses of PoM just in general. It's going to boost your damage a lot on AoE. So first for stat priorities, I want to cover the amount of spell hit that we need. So now in Wrath of the Lich King, there's no longer a 1% chance to miss with spells. So we need 17% as opposed to 16% in TBC. And the TLDR is that we need 8% as Arcane and 7% if you also have a Drain Eye in your party, if you got a Goat. So the reason for that is we get 3% from Arcane Focus. We also get 3% from Precision, so that's 6. We get another 3% from a debuff from the Shadow Priest or Boomkin in your raid, so as long as you have one of them in your raid, and that puts a debuff on the mob. That's going to give an extra 3% chance to hit with spells. So that's 9%, which will be 8% needed total. And then again, if you have that Goat in your party, then you only need 7%. Go Alliance. And then for other stat priorities, I have it up here on the screen. Basically, you're gonna obviously want to go to you're gonna want to get capped on hit, then spell power. After that, spell haste, spell crit, spirit, and int. That's kind of the general order of what's most valuable to us. However, it's just not that simple, right? Each item is going to have differing amounts of them, and to figure out the stat weights, it's going to be dynamic based on your gear, your raid environment, the amount of time for the encounter, the fight length, so all these things you really need to use a sim. I love 80 upgrades. A lot of people have mentioned, hey, can I trust the stat weights in 80 upgrades, the default ones? The answer is absolutely not. Okay, 80 upgrades is great, and he tried to make some stat weights that are generally applicable, but the stat weights for you are going to be very different than the stat weights for another person. It depends on your raid DPS and how fast you're killing the boss and all these other things. So 80 upgrades is great. I love 80 upgrades. I use it all the time. It's a great way to share with other people as well as to just look through gear and keep track of your gear, etc., etc. But as far as figuring out stat weights and what gear is more, which gear is better and whether it's an upgrade or not, you really have to be using a sim. I have the link to the one of the most popular sims that we generally use in the Mage Discord, as well as a secondary sim that's also used. Both are great, but again, this is the one that we mainly use. Shout outs to Ostivel for creating this. And you really just have to get used to using this. I'll also be coming out with a video eventually on simming and a general template that you can use for everything to be set up. But just ignore some of this stuff on here. It's because I was screwing with things with Incanter's Absorption build. But you really have to use a sim to know what your stat weights are and whether an item is going to be better or not. You can't just go by stat priorities or by just default stat weights that are provided from something like AD upgrades. Then, while I'm not going to cover gearing, I will cover gemming real quick because it goes off the same stat priority that I've already talked about before. So, right, spell power, haste, and then everything else. So here, if you don't have a good socket bonus, you're going to be using Rune Scarlet Ruby plus 19 spell power. And then if there is a decent socket bonus, so in this case, this yellow socket, 4 hit rating, I need that hit rating. So then you're going to use the Reckless Monarch Topaz, the orange gem, 9 spell power, 8 haste. And that's typically what you're going to use, is always the red gems, unless it has a decent socket bonus, in which case you could use a Reckless Monarch Topaz. Also, always make sure to use your 2 blue gems to activate your meta gem, and for those blue gems, you're going to want to use 9 spell power and 8 spirit. And then your meta gem, similar to TBC, it's just got a different name, a little upgraded now, Chaotic Skyflare Diamond. It requires 2 blue gems just like before, and that's where you're definitely going to want to use it. It's better than everything else. For consume, some changes from TBC are that we no longer use oils, as oils no longer work on items with a item level higher than 165, and there's no oil in Wrath of the Lich King to replace the old oils. And then we also no longer use Kriegs, as the Kriegs now counts as a food buff, so you're not going to be using that either. You can still use Crystal of Insight as Alliance, although it's only 5 int, so at this point it's just definitely not really worth that much. But if you want to continue min-maxing with that, you can. But the big things are just make sure you have your flask, the new Flask of the Frostworm, 125 spell power, as well as your spell power food. If someone drops a Fish Feast, you can use that instead, of course, and everyone saves money that way. And then there's also hit food, as you can see on the screen here. Snapper Extreme gives 40 hit rating, so you can use that if you need to get hit capped, although I recommend getting hit capped through your gearing, and that way you can just use the Fish Feast that's dropped down and you don't have to be worrying about using your own food. And then for potions, you're going to want to use Potion of Speed. If you're Troll and you have Berserking and you start to get Phase 1 Bis and also Embrace of the Spider, then you won't, even if you delay your Berserking, you'll get Haste Capped and you'll eventually have to start using Potion of Wild Magic. But for everyone else and before then, you're going to want to use Potion of Speed for your pre-pot, as well as in combat. It's going to be your most damage. You're still going to want to have Runic Mana Potions to pop on trash, just to keep the pump up while you're moving, if you're in a fast moving guild. However, if your guild goes slowly, then you could just use Potion of Speed on trash as well. And another consume that was just recently, as of yesterday, found to stack with both food and Divine Spirit is Mistletoe. So if you have any Mistletoes left over from the Christmas event, it'll give you an extra 20 Spirit. You can't put it on yourself, though. You have to put it on a friend, so hopefully you have a friend to trade it with. But it's an extra free 20 Spirit, which is some critical strike rating for us, so that's great. Shoutouts to Derishley for finding that. Thanks, brother. Alright, so for professions, this section applies to all mage specs, so I'm going to include it in all my mage guides. And bottom line, you can see at the top of the screen here, I've listed the priority as far as biz professions. Engineering is above everything else, then tailoring, then jewelcrafting, and then inscription, blacksmithing, alchemy, and leatherworking and enchanting are all about the same, assuming that epic gems are out. If the epic gems aren't out, then blacksmithing is underneath those 4. So first, engineering. It's too big. There's too many things we get from it. We get the 340 haste for 12 seconds, 1 minute CD. On use on our glove enchant. We also get a boot enchant, nitro boots, so 24 crit and 100% movement speed. If you're not tailoring for whatever reason, then you also get a cloak enchant, which is 27 spell power, which replaces the 23 haste and is better. We also get injectors, which give us 25% more mana when we use a mana pot. You get explosives, and that's huge. You get sappers and grenades for extra AoE damage, which is one of the big reasons you go that. Engineering also gives you your pre-bis helm. And it's also just got a bunch of little fun perks like Jeeves, which will come out in patch or phase 3 TOGC, which allows you to access your bank from anywhere. So engineering, highly recommend going engineering. It's too good. Next best after that is tailoring. It gives you a cloak enchant, 295 spell power for 15 seconds with a 60-second ICD. It says 45-second here, but that's incorrect. It's 60 seconds. It's the only real issue with this table, the only error with this table, I should say. And tailoring,
because you're a gangster and you're a champion.
Tailoring is the next best with that cloak enchant and the proc. and CD stacking, it allows it to be the next best by far for DPS. From there, it's Jewelcrafting above everything else. And then it goes Inscription, Alchemy, Leatherworking, Enchanting are all about the same. And from there, then Blacksmithing, and then everything else. And the thing about this table is it's assuming that Epic Gems are already out. So that won't be until Phase 3. So this is listing a plus 48 spell power for Jewelcrafting, but actually before Epic Gems are out, this is actually a lot higher. And I'm going to get into some details about that in a second here. But before that, so that's also assuming here for Blacksmithing that the Epic Gems are out. If Epic Gems aren't out, Blacksmithing isn't as good, and that's why it's a step below. But otherwise, if for whatever reason you're not going to be some of the best ones like Engineering or Tailoring, then I definitely would recommend Jewelcrafting at least, because until Epic Gems come out, it's a step above everything else. But otherwise, the rest of these professions such as Enchanting, Leatherworking, Alchemy, and Inscription are all basically about the same. And you can just read through the different things here. You can go check out my Discord, and you can check out the pinned in the Wrath of the Lich King chat, and you can take a look at this table. Also for Leatherworking, just note that if they don't fix lesser drums of speed, which currently give a speed buff without tinnitus, then that's going to be probably a requirement for speedrunning. So if you're speedrunning, you're going to need that, because 4 people in your party can just rotate those drums of speed. Then you can have constant movement speed, and you still get a good wrist, the bracer enchant. So it's going to be the profession to go if you're in a speedrunning guild and they don't change that for whatever reason. Now, the other thing that I want to mention is, so because Jewelcrafting, before the Epic Gems come out, this bonus is actually a lot higher. I believe it's plus 64 spell power. Then someone made a table as far as Jewelcrafting versus Lightweave proc over a period of time. So say in a speedrunning guild, you're getting the Lightweave proc, and this is how much it's giving from the start of the combat time to later on. The Jewelcrafting is just always giving you spell power, right? And so over time, actually, that Jewelcrafting before Epic Gems are out is a little, like, for a 300-second fight, which those don't exist in Nax, but since you're constantly moving in Nax in a speedrun, then you kind of do get that effect. And Jewelcrafting could come out ahead. Now, I still recommend going Tailoring, because this table is just looking at the average spell power. It's not taking into account CD stacking and other things that happen with the Cloak enchant. At the same time, you could get a Cloak proc when combat isn't actually happening, right? Maybe on like your last cast or something like that, which would waste a lot of that spell power. So I can see it both ways, but the bottom line is, like, this is now the table for when Jewelcrafting, when Epic Gems are out for Jewelcrafting, and you can see that Tailoring is then way ahead. So if you really wanted to, you could make the argument of going Engineering and Jewelcrafting until Epic Gems are out, and then going Engineering and Tailoring. However, I would say just go Engineering and Tailoring, don't worry about it. That's going to last you the entire expansion. And this graph isn't taking into account the CD stacking that can happen with the proc from the Cloak enchant. So that's just my 2 cents on it. And kind of all of it doesn't really matter if Blizzard doesn't do anything about these lesser drums of speed not giving tinnitus buff, because then we're all going to be going Leatherworking in our speedrunning guilds anyways. Blizzard, please help us. Alright, for the best raise to go for Arcane Mage, Troll is above everything else for Horde. Berserking is just too good, so you're going to want to be Troll if you're Horde. After that, for Alliance, it's a little different. So Draenei, if you need the 1% hit for your party, that's going to be above everything else. I don't actually recommend it for Mage, because Mage should typically be with Resto Shaman if your raid's running a Resto Shaman. And while it might not be in Nax, it should be later on in the expansion. And with that Resto Shaman, then you're going to want to be in that party for the Manatide Totem. And thus, your party is already getting the 1% Draenei, or the 1% hit from Draenei. So it'd be a waste if the Mage is also it. So I don't necessarily recommend it, but work that out with your guild. If you're willing to do that, then that's pretty huge of you. You're a champion, and it's good to be providing that 1% hit. You certainly want somebody in the party providing it. After that, Gnome is actually above Human. I don't like saying that because I'm not a fan of Gnomes. Sorry, it's just the way I am. But Gnome does give more DPS than a Human. Niche has a great breakdown here on the Mage Discord, pinned in the Wrath of the Lich King PVE channel, and I will also print it in my Discord and give credits to him. Breaks down in Tier 7 gear as well as endgame gear, the DPS difference between Gnome and Human, or at least not necessarily DPS difference, but the stat difference. Bottom line is Gnome is going to be giving more crit, as well as a little extra spell damage via the Mind Mastery talent over a Human. And while Human has every man for himself, the PvP trinket as part of the racial, which allows them to get out of any CC. Us as mages have Ice Block as well as Blink to get out of stuns. So we typically don't need that. So a human could be a little bit better on some of the encounters where you maybe need to get out of multiple CCs, but gnomes also have the escape artist, and just overall they're going to have more crit and spell power over human, and thus more DPS. However, you have to sacrifice your dignity by playing a gnome just for that little extra DPS, so I don't think it's worth it. I personally say go human. Alright, so the basic rotation of Arcane Spec is going to be using Arcane Blast until you get up to 4 stacks, and then you use Arcane Missiles with your Missile Barrage proc, and you rinse and repeat. However, you're not always going to get that Missile Barrage proc. Even though it's a 40% chance on every single Arcane Blast, there's a fair amount of times you're not going to get it. And so then what do you do then? How far do you continue to fish past 4 stacks until you get the Missile Barrage? Do you just keep going until you go and then you evocate? So there's actually some nuance there, and I'm going to explain that through a mana efficiency graph. But first, I should probably explain why we don't use Arcane Barrage in order to dump our stacks instead of just hard casting Arcane Missiles. And the reason for that is actually that Mecha from the Mage Discord, shoutouts to him for the great work on this and the great write-up in the pin, and I also have it at a Nightbot command for my channel and Discord as well, with credits going to him. He has shown that you can hard cast Arcane Missiles with more mana efficiency and average damage than Arcane Barrage. So even if you don't have a proc, say you're up to 6 stacks already and you don't have a Missile Barrage proc, you'd still just want to hard cast your Arcane Missiles. I mean, it's been dubbed Missile Barrage gambling, and the reason for that is that after you do that last Arcane Blast, like right here, if I just do Arcane Missiles right into it, there's still a 40% chance that that Arcane Blast finishing the cast will give me a Missile Barrage proc. And so on average, hard casting Arcane Missiles like that is still going to be better DPS than Arcane Barrage when it comes to dumping your stacks, because you are needing to go to a more conservative mana rotation. And so this is why there can be specs that don't pick up Arcane Barrage at all, because you just don't use it for dumping stacks. You only use Arcane Barrage for doing damage on the move. So now that I've talked about Missile Barrage gambling, I can speak to this mana efficiency graph for different Missile Barrage rotations. This graph was made by SVB from the Mage Discord, shoutouts to him for the great work, and essentially what we have is DPS on the y-axis and mana efficiency on the x-axis, and then a number of different rotations placed on the graph. And to interpret these rotations, the numbers refer to the number of Arcane Blast casts from 0 stacks, and if you have a Missile Barrage proc, you will use it and cast Arcane Missiles if your cast number is higher than the left number. And then if you don't have a Missile Barrage proc, you will keep casting until you reach the number on the right, in which case you would then cast Arcane Missiles regardless of whether or not you have a Missile Barrage proc. So for an example, let's take the 4-6 rotation. You will cast Arcane Blast until you've done 4 casts and thus are at 4 stacks, and at that point, if you have a Missile Barrage proc, you would cast Arcane Missiles and consume the proc, and if you don't, you would keep casting Arcane Blast, fishing for a Missile Barrage proc, and as soon as you get the proc, you would cast Arcane Missiles. And if you don't get the proc, then at 6 casts, you would use Arcane Missiles even if you don't have the proc. So essentially this graph is giving an idea of how high a DPS rotation is in terms of its mana efficiency, and we see that the sweet spot is right between 4-6 and 4-8. And this is why private servers would always recommend simply going to 4 stacks and using Missile Barrage, and that if you don't have a Missile Barrage proc at that point, to keep casting Arcane Blast and fishing for a Missile Barrage proc until you get the proc, and then using Arcane Missiles, because it's pretty likely that by 8 stacks you will get Missile Barrage proc, and thus, you usually don't get that unlucky to have to go past 8. And this is a pretty good rotation. It's high DPS and also mana efficient. And then they just say that if you get low on mana, just go to a more conservative rotation where you use the Missile Barrage proc at 3 stacks or even lower. So while you can follow that more simple route, a better way is to get a feel for your raid environment and how long a fight is, and then plan ahead for what you want that right number to be, i.e. where you'll draw the line on fishing for Missile Barrage procs and have to hard cast an Arcane Missiles to drop your stack, because believe me, you can get unlucky and at 4 stacks have to just constantly be casting Arcane Blast, hoping for a Missile Barrage proc, and it could be 6, 8, 10 casts before you get there if you get unlucky, and that'll just kill your entire mana bar. So a better way is to actually just plan ahead for when you're going to draw the line and just cast Arcane Missiles to drop your stacks. As you saw from the graph, it's definitely best to go up to 4 stacks before you use your Missile Barrage proc, and then it's also good to fish past that sum if you don't have a Missile Barrage proc, and to use it once you get it, and you just have to know what that number is. So private servers those guides don't seem to include the fact that you can get really unlucky and you can be casting Arcane Blast at 4 stacks a number of times before you get that Missile Barrage, and they don't go into the nuance like I just did with the graph as far as where you're gonna draw the line. If it's a shorter fight, you could go, so like right now, I could do a number of casts past 4 in order to get the Missile Barrage proc, even though that's more mana intensive. I can afford it if it's a shorter fight, and if it's a longer fight, you're going to want to maybe drop that number down a bit in order to be able to have enough mana, because you always want to try to go to 4 stacks. If you end up having to use Missile Barrage at lower than 4 stacks, it's going to kill your DPS a fair amount. Now, obviously, it's more mana efficient, but it's going to hurt your DPS. Another thing to mention is that you don't ever interrupt your cast in order to use the Missile Barrage proc. So let's say I want to be using the Missile Barrage right here at 4 stack. Let's say I didn't get it though, and I'm continue casting and I'm fishing, and now I suddenly got it. You wait until this Arcane Blast finishes, and then you use the Missile Barrage. And the reason for that is if you're interrupting like that, you're interrupting you're adding huge gaps into your time, and that's going to be a DPS loss overall. So you just always are queuing up your next Arcane Blast, and then you just use the Missile Barrage once that next Arcane Blast finishes. And the last thing is that remember, you're an Arcane Mage, so you want to end the fight with 0 mana. So if the fight is looking like it's about to end and you still have a lot of mana left, start casting Arcane Blast, chain casting it in order to dump the rest of your mana. And then for the end of the fight, just one little tip is that now that the end of the encounter is going to reset your CDs, what you could do is do one last Arcane Blast and then start casting Evocation right before the boss dies. And when the boss dies, all your CDs will reset, including Evocation, and that way you'll have Evocation right off CD for the next trash pack to be able to evocate and get up to full mana before the next boss. Just another little tip. So now I want to talk about our opener and our burst window, but first I want to just emphasize that if you're going to be having any movement in the fight, then don't use PoM for the opener and save PoM for the movement. Do a PoM Arcane Blast, it'll be your best way of using PoM. However, if it's a tank and spank, you can use PoM as I'm about to explain here. And the other thing that I want to note is that for potions, if you didn't know, in Wrath of the Lich King, you can only use 1 potion per combat session. So the reason that we pre-pot is so that we can get 2 in, assuming that the combat session is at least longer than a minute. Because you'll use it, it'll go on a minute cooldown, and then after a minute into the fight, you'd be able to use another potion. So now for the opener, I'm first going to explain it, and then I'll show an example of it. And so basically how this is going to work is that your raid leader is going to give a countdown, specifically because of the pre-pot, so that everyone is on the same page and can get that pre-pot off before combat starts. And so you'll pop mirror images at 3 seconds, and then you'll use Potion of Speed and cast Arcane Blast. You'll stack up to 2, and then you'll use your PoM to do another Arcane Blast. Then you'll follow up with another Arcane Blast after that, and at 4 stacks, assuming you have a Missile Barrage proc, you're going to pop all CDs with a macro such as this, which is going to use your trinkets, your gloves, Arcane Power, Icy Veins, and also your Arcane Missiles. And from there, you're going to stack back up to 4 stacks, use another Missile Barrage proc, and do that again. Depending on your haste, you can fit in 2 Missile Barrage procs after that first initial one. But if you don't have enough haste, then you'll want to, after the first initial Missile Barrage proc, do 6 or 7 Arcane Blasts, finish with a Missile Barrage proc. And the reason for that is that Arcane Power scales dynamically with your Arcane Missiles. So if your Arcane Power runs out in the middle of your Arcane Missiles, the latter part of the Arcane Missiles won't be benefiting from Arcane Power. Those missiles will be doing less damage. It doesn't snapshot. So you need to make sure to use the Arcane Missiles during the Arcane Power. So you want to end that Arcane Power with a full Arcane Missiles, and you don't want to be using that prematurely. So you don't want in the last few seconds of your Arcane Power to be restacking your Arcane Blast debuffs. And so that's just a little min-max tips in order to min-max your damage during the burst window. And the main thing is that during your burst window, you want to make sure that you have enough mana so that you can be using Arcane Blast and fishing for Missile Barrage procs. You don't want to have to be using Missile Barrage at 2 or 3. That is not the time to be doing a conservative rotation. So if anything, do mana management outside of that burst window so that during the burst window you can be either spamming Arcane Blast, fishing for Missile Barrage proc, or at least getting up to that 4 stacks and using a Missile Barrage proc. Also, the reason we use PoM after the second cast and not after the third is because in Wrath of the Lich King, you can't use Presence of Mind and Arcane Power at the same time. So if you use PoM, it also puts Arcane Power on a 1.5 second delay. So if we use PoM right after the third cast in order to get to 4 stacks, and then we try and use the macro, everything in the macro will be able to go off sooner than the Arcane Power. So you'd have to essentially be waiting about a half-second gap it can be up to in order to be able to use this macro and use Arcane Powers, that's going to be a DPS loss by having to wait like that. Or you're going to use everything in the macro and your Arcane Missiles is going to go off without using Arcane Power, which is obviously also not ideal. ideal. So we use it after the second cast, and then you just hard cast another AB so that you can go right into the macro from there. Also, the reason we use the PoM after the second cast and not right away at the beginning is because of Arcane Potency and the fact that it has a 30% extra chance to crit. So you want to use it a couple stacks, you know, higher debuff stacks, so that Arcane Blast is going to do more damage, and that way if it crits, it's making more use out of a critted Arcane Blast with a couple stacks, debuff stacks, as opposed to none. And also a couple casts is enough to be able to possibly activate some ICD trinkets, so then you're getting CD stacking along with that 30% extra crit chance. So your raid leader is going to give a pull timer. Let's say pull timer 8. Remember, we're going to use our mirror images at 3 and then go into Potion of Speed with Arcane Blast right after that, like so. And after 2 Arcane Blasts, we're going to use a PoM AB, hard cast another one right into our macro with all the Arcane Missiles, and then we're going to stack up to 4 stacks, use another Mbarr, stack up to 4 stacks again, use another Mbarr. In this case, I don't have enough haste to be able to do that because I don't have Bloodlust, but if I had Bloodlust, I would have enough haste to be able to restack up to 4 and use another Mbarr. Also, if you've been watching other guides from private servers, you may be asking why I don't use PoM for the Arcane Potency buff with Arcane Missiles, and that's because it clearly worked differently on private servers, because on live, Arcane Potency is consumed by the very first missile. So you don't want to use Arcane Potency with Arcane Missiles. The very first of the 5 missiles that Arcane Missiles shoot out, the first one just consumes the Arcane Potency. So it doesn't apply to the entire Arcane Missile channel. So that's why we don't use PoM with Arcane Missiles with the Arcane Potency buff like that. And it's also why if you get a clear casting proc and then Arcane Potency, you'd want to use it ideally on an Arcane Blast and not Arcane Missiles. And lastly, for the burst window, I just want to touch on haste so that you're not wasting haste during that burst window by using too many different haste cooldowns at once. Shoutouts to Mecha from the Mage Discord for making this great table. And basically the TLDR is that once you get Embrace of the Spider, which is our phase 1 bis trinket as Alliance, you're going to then want to switch your Potion of Speed to Potion of Wild Magic in order to not be haste capped. And then as Horde for Berserking, the general consensus is that you're going to want to delay that until after your burst window, because otherwise Lust, Icy Veins, Berserking, and also a Potion of Speed, you're definitely going to be over haste cap. So delay the Berserking, and then once you get Embrace of the Spider, change that Potion of Speed to Potion of Wild Magic, and that should sufficiently separate out your haste cooldown so that you're not wasting a lot of haste. And again, for these burst windows, if you're only wasting like 30 haste, not a big deal, then it's still probably worth it to use the haste in the burst window in order to maximize your burst window. But at a certain point, you're wasting too much haste, and that's going to be a DPS loss instead of separating them out. But the general consensus is just separate out your Berserking. You should be good to go as Horde, and then also with the Embrace of the Spider, you just change your Potion of Speed to Potion of Wild Magic. You'll be good to go. So that's an example of your opener, but also your burst window. You want to be stacking your cooldowns as much as possible for your burst window, and you want to have as many burst windows as you can. That said, though, as far as cooldown management goes, you don't want to sacrifice a cooldown usage for a burst window. And by that, what I mean is, say the fight is going to be 3 minutes. You use all your cooldowns at the start, or maybe a little longer than 3 minutes. Use all the cooldowns at the start like I just showed you. You don't want to wait until Icy Veins comes off cooldown to use your second Arcane Power, because if you do that, you're going to jip yourself out of an Arcane Power. As you can see on the timeline on the screen, you could instead use all your cooldowns at the start. As soon as Arcane Power comes off cooldown, you use Arcane Power, and then you wait until later on in the fight. Arcane Power and Icy Veins will be back up at the same time once again before the fight ends, and you can have that good burst window once again. And same with your trinkets. So your trinket, if you have a 2-minute cooldown on a trinket, you wouldn't want to use it right when it comes off cooldown, because you can just wait until Icy Veins and Arcane Power are off CD for that final burst window before the fight ends, because you know the fight's going to be about 3 minutes. And if the fight's only, say, 2 minutes, though, on the other hand, right, you would use Arcane Power right when it comes off cooldown, because Icy Veins isn't going to be off cooldown before the fight ends, because it's a 2.5 or 2.4 minute cooldown spell. So you have to know what the fight length is for optimal cooldown usage, and you want to maximize your amount of burst windows, but not at the expense of using your CDs. So it's just kind of a little game with knowing how long of a fight is, and you just kind of have to get used to that and get used to knowing how long fights are based on your guild and how fast you kill the bosses. Typically what I do is I just look at the previous week's kills, and I also try and take into account, okay, were there people that died during this encounter? Like, was it really sloppy? Is it going to be maybe better executed this week, and thus it's going to be a lot shorter of a fight length? And then I try and, adjust my cooldown usages based on that. And then if things start to go awry in a fight, a bunch of people die, and you see that it's going to be getting longer, to try and take that into account on the fly. And it's just something you have to get a feel for. But you definitely, it's going to be big for your damage in phase 1 for rankings, and just if you care about your overall damage and whatnot, to maximize that cooldown usage as I just explained. As far as raid CDs that are available to us, it's very similar to TBC. We have Power Infusion, Mana Tide Totem, and Innervate. Power Infusion is going to be best on another class, assuming all player skill is equal. But if you're in a guild where you're a pumper compared to some of the other players, you know, no offense to those other players, but it's going to be best on your pumper because they're going to continue to use it off CD as much as possible, and they're also going to maximize it in terms of with other CDs. So if you're a pumper, take the Power Infusion. Don't feel bad about it. But otherwise, it would be better. If you have other pumpers with different classes, it's probably better to go on them. Innervate, though, is still going to be best on us for damage-wise unless your healers really need it. And then Mana Tide Totem, it would be great to be with the Resto Shaman if you're running a Resto Shaman in phase 1 or beyond, because the Mana Tide Totem is going to just be helpful. It's not a lot of mana, but it's still at least some, and all mana for us is damage. And also, things like Innervate and Mana Tide Totem, they allow you to be a little more greedy with your Arcane Missile, your Missile Barrage gambling. You can go to that higher stacks with the Missile Barrage gambling when you know that you have an Innervate in your back pocket as well as a Mana Tide Totem. So those are definitely raid CDs that if your healers don't need them, I highly suggest you utilize. You can develop macros for them. Check out my Discord, and I'll have macros posted there, as well as weak auras for tracking Mana Tide and Innervate cooldowns, as well as, you know, whispering your shaman, and also weak auras for them that remind them, hey, I got to drop a Mana Tide once they see that you've whispered them, as well as for Innervate. So check that out. It can be helpful for your guild in order to make their lives easier for giving you Innervate Mana Tide, because it's obviously kind of a nightmare. So try and make their lives as easy as possible for that. And speaking of raid buffs, we now have to talk about Focus Magic and who this is best to go to. You can see the order here on the screen, with Fire Mage being at the top, and then you know, Affliction and Shadow Priest being about equal, Arcane Mage, and etc. etc. The thing with this is you know, this is credits to Yurple for using the WoW sim to go through and determine that order. But again, these sims are still being figured out, so it's subject to change. You know, take it with a grain of salt. Not sure how much we can necessarily trust it. So in my opinion, the best way to use Focus Magic is to give it to your pumpers. Even in the top guilds, there's some people that pump a lot harder than others, and it's going to best go to those players because they're going to just best utilize that 3% crit, because they're just going to do the most amount of casts, right? And so the most amount of casts are going to benefit from this. So because the DPS difference is so small, we're talking, you know, Fire Mage, I think it benefits 250 DPS, which is quite a bit. But after that, it's like 200-ish, or 200 for Affliction and Shadow Priest, something like that. Arcane Mage around 150 or so. So like the DPS differences between the classes is fairly small. All of them, all classes should be able to keep up the 3% buff for 10 seconds. And if your guild is okay with it, you could just trade with another Arcane Mage, and then you both benefit. But if you're in a sweaty guild, then obviously they're going to want it to go to whoever is providing the most raid DPS. But again, I just argue player over class. And then also, you know, I don't know how much we can trust these numbers, to be honest. I will update this in a pinned comment later on if we get this better figured out. But eventually, assuming we're going to be going fire later, you'll just be trading with another Fire Mage anyways. So let people get used to the fact that it's just going to stay within the Mage Brotherhood. The last thing I want to cover is just basically a PSA on using no channel in your Arcane Blast as a macro. So what I mean by that, and the reason is that you don't want to clip your Arcane Missiles. So if you're casting Arcane Missiles, say a hard one like this, if you start casting Arcane Blast too soon like that, you can see that I only got 4 missiles. I clipped it too early, even though it didn't look like it. Like, it looked like I started casting that Arcane Blast pretty much towards the end, but it's still, the 5th missile hadn't gone off yet. And so because of that, I clipped it, and we didn't get that 5th missile, which is a lot of damage. If you do that too many times over the course of a fight, it's going to cost you a lot of damage, right? So what you can do is use a macro, which has no channeling in it. And what that's going to do is, as you're channeling your Arcane Missiles, you can be mashing the macro, and it won't interrupt, it won't cast the Arcane Blast until your Arcane Missiles is dead. Done. Okay. And the rest of this in this macro is just basically, it makes it so your Arcane Blast tab targets, as well as once the mob is dead, then it clears it. So there's just some nice things to have into your main ability that you're mashing. I highly recommend including those in there. But the main thing is that you want this no channeling. So you don't have to use it though. You could just go without no channeling, right? Where you're going to try and time it right after that 5th missile is cast, And because the downside to using the macro is that you're going to introduce micro gaps into your casting based on the amount of ping. So every time, because it's having to do a check to see if you're channeling, and it's not actually going to be able to send the Arcane Blast cast to the server until you're done channeling. So there's going to be a little gap based on your ping. Now, if it's, let's say your ping is only 40 milliseconds, well, then that's not very much of a micro gap. And most people's ping is only pretty low, like 40 milliseconds, or certainly less than 100 milliseconds. So those micro gaps aren't going to be very much. So the general rule is if you have low ping and you aren't going to play perfectly, you know, let's say you're going to clip even just one missile, then it's better just to use no channeling, because it's not going to add up to that much cast time, and clipping even like 1 or 2 missiles is pretty big. So I would recommend, if you have low ping, you're not going to play perfectly, use the no channeling macro. Now, however, if you have high ping, then those micro gaps are probably going to start to add up. So if you have high ping and you're only going to clip maybe a few times or less, then it could be better to actually just practice, really focus every time you're playing. Don't use no channeling, and just try and time it right after that 5th missile cast. You know, go practice on a target dummy, and you can get it down, and then that way that's going to be better for you. Otherwise, that high ping micro gaps are going to be in there. You also, if you have low ping and you're going to play perfectly, then sure, you don't have to use the no channeling macro. But just keep in mind, it can be pretty easy to clip those just when you have like everything being popped. You know, a lot of haste. Your casts are really fast. Your Arcane Missiles is only like 1.2 seconds or something like that once we get more haste. So it can be pretty easy to clip that 5th missile, and those can add up. So I recommend using the no channeling. I think it's just an easier way to play. And it ensures it's just going to be more consistent, but it's also not like the super optimal way. It's more like the kind of this like surefire way. So you could go either way, you know, it's up to you. My recommendation is just using no channeling, just because I found it's actually pretty easy to clip that 5th missile if you're not really paying attention. You know, you can certainly focus to do that, but when there's a lot going on and you're maybe having to like make calls or something like that, then it could lead to clipping those missiles. Basically, I'm just admitting that I'm a boomer, and this is just an easy way for me to stay consistent in my damage. Now, the last thing to cover is the optimal usage of your AoE. So if the mobs are going to be lasting long enough to take the full damage of a Flame Strike tick, then you're going to want to use a Flame Strike rank 9 into a Flame Strike rank 8, and then you're going to want to go into your Blizzard. However, a lot of times in Nax, things die way before this Flame Strike dot gets to fully tick, or the mobs are being dragged because Nax is just easy, so your tanks can just keep moving on the run. Everyone can just basically hold W while killing everything, so Flame Strike doesn't get the benefit then. So a lot of times in that case, you're just going to want a Blizzard and then recast Blizzard. Something important to note with that though is, so Blizzard, the clear casting procs are on tick, are on hit for each mob being hit, so you can get a lot of clear casting procs, as you can see here. Like I just got one in the middle of the Blizzard cast. It's not on cast, it's on hit, and it's by the amount of mobs. So with a lot of mobs, you have a great chance of getting a clear casting proc. Now, you don't want to just right away recast it, because when you get the clear casting proc, you get Arcane Potency, and as soon as you recast, you lose that Arcane Potency. So once you get a clear casting proc in the Arcane Potency, try not to recast unless you have to, like the mobs have moved on, because then the rest of that Blizzard is benefiting from the 30% crit chance from the Arcane Potency. And just another thing, because of the fact that Blizzard can proc clear casting so much, that's what makes it so great also for AoE and Nax, is it's just really mana efficient, because every time you cast it, there's a good chance you're going to get a clear casting proc from it. So you can just a lot of times really chain, depending on the amount of mobs, your Blizzard into another free cast or free mana Blizzard. Like as you can see here, I've just been Blizzarding this entire time and I'm not going So that's what makes Blizzard so great. And then the other thing you want to min-max, obviously you want to be using your cooldowns with your Blizzard for extra damage just on the run on trash. But the other thing you can do is Presence of Mind. So I touched on this earlier. You make that macro, which is going to use Presence of Mind before your Blizzard, and you use that, and then that gives you Arcane Potency, which lasts during the entire Blizzard, right? So that entire Blizzard benefits from it, and then you still have PoM to use at the end as well, and it gets you an instant cast Flame Strike. So ideally, you're going to want to use that when the mobs are going to last for that first full Blizzard, and then also last for the Flame Strike tick at the end there. Or you could just use the macro for mobs that are going to die after that Blizzard, and then you have the instant cast Flame Strike queued up for the next mobs. not exactly ideal, but you could also just do that too. Another thing is you can pre-cast Flame Strike. So if you know where the tanks are going to be bringing the mobs to, pre-cast the Flame Strike and get the dot already on the ground. They'll run in, get the dot, and then you just have put Blizzard right on top of them. And also, if it's going to be a very spicy pull, use those mirror images on trash. That's very helpful because you can pop mirror images. You don't have to worry about threat then, and you can just right away go ham and not have to worry about ripping aggro from the tanks. The only other thing to mention from here is also if you're having to hold W a lot, depending on how fast your guild is moving, then don't be afraid to just use Arcane Explosion. Arcane Explosion is still good. It's just going to tear through your mana faster than Blizzard because of the fact that Blizzard has those extra chances to get clear casting procs, so you can really just keep chaining Blizzards. And it doesn't also do as much damage as Blizzard, but it's a lot better than just having to chain cast Blizzard from, like, if your tank is just holding W like this, then you're gonna burn through a lot of mana from just having to chain cast Blizzard as he's moving, and then you're gonna have to blink to catch up and whatnot. So depending on how your guild is W keying through Nax, don't be afraid to just stay with the tanks and be Arcane Explosioning as you go. That's still going to be good damage. And yeah, but otherwise, Flame Strike, if the mobs are just standing still and they're going to last for a while, Flame Strike rank 9 into rank 8 into Blizzard, and then also utilize that PoM Blizzard trick so that you get the Arcane Potency, and pay attention to those clear casting procs with your Blizzard to be benefiting from the Arcane Potency as well. And that's everything that I want to cover in this guide. Hope it was very helpful. I know some things weren't covered, such as gearing, as well as weak auras, add-ons, and macros. Those will be coming at a later date. I was hoping to maybe wait until some of the Wrath of the Lich King content comes out, because more weak auras will become available, as well as updated add-ons and whatnot. So future video for those, so stay tuned for those. Hit the like and subscribe if you like the content and want to catch that, as well as drop me a follow at twitch.tv/Criteria. I really appreciate everyone that shows up to the streams and provides me support there. It really means a lot. And then that can also give you a chance to see how all this comes together in a live format, and hopefully it can help you learn from there if you still have some questions. Also, if you still have some questions, feel free to drop me questions at the stream or join my Discord. The link is in the description. You can be up to date on the current content, discussions, as well as, again, ask any of those questions that you may have. And again, for gearing, the pre-bis guide is actually already out, and the phase 1 bis guide will be coming soon. That's all I got. Thank you again for watching, and good luck in Northrend. I didn't want to die. Oh. Come on, come on, come on, come on.
Find shield.
Stack now.
On circle, on circle.
Freedom out of the
I'm not gonna make it. No.
I don't know if I got those breaths.
Gotta do this before the next cast. Come on, burn, burn, burn.
Is that our last shield?
Yeah, that was it.
We're going catalyst.
No, 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 no.
Watch out.
Took us down.
Shadowburn, execute, go!
No,
Go!
no,
Somebody.
no way,
Okay.
no.
You cold-blooded bastard.
Please, please. Orok, please.
Lay on hands yourself if you have it.
Oh, oh my god!
Let's go!
No, take a screenshot of yourself, bro.
All right!
That was insane.
Holy shit!